The day Caleb Harrow's soul came back to him arrived in the shape of a woman he had never seen before, standing on his porch without permission, dripping rain onto his floorboards, and looking at him like she had every right to be there. The year was 1882, and the Montana Territory was still the kind of place where a man could go 7 years without smiling and nobody would think to ask him why. The land was vast and indifferent, the sky above the Beartooth foothills a permanent shade of iron gray in November, and the wind off the mountains had a way of cutting through wool coats and reaching into a man's chest to remind him that warmth was never guaranteed. Caleb Harrow had built his ranch, the Double H, over the course of 11 years through the kind of back-breaking labor that leaves a man lean and hard-edged, his hands roughened into things that looked more like tools than flesh. He ran 400 head of cattle, employed 3 ranch hands, and had a reputation in the nearby town of Redstone as a man who paid fair wages and asked no questions so long as the work got done. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply sealed up, the way a house gets sealed up after someone dies inside it, all the windows latched, all the curtains drawn, no light getting in and no warmth getting out. His name in Redstone was spoken with a particular kind of careful respect, the way people speak around something that once shattered and was never quite put back right. The older folks remembered the Caleb Harrow who used to ride into town on Saturday afternoons with his wife, Clara, and their young daughter, Ellie, remembered how Clara would laugh at something he said, and how he would tip his hat to hide the pleased look on his face. They remembered the Caleb who once played fiddle at the harvest dance, badly but enthusiastically, and who had called out to old Tom Bassett from across Main Street just to tell him his new coat looked fine. They remembered the before Caleb, the one who had smiled like he meant it. Then came the winter of 1875, and a fever that swept through the territory the way fire sweeps through dry grass, fast and total and leaving nothing standing. Clara had been 28 years old. Ellie had been 4. They went within a week of each other, the little girl first, then her mother, as though Clara simply refused to be in a world that no longer contained her daughter. Caleb had buried them on the low hill east of the barn, beneath a cottonwood that turned golden every October, and he had walked back down from that hill a different man than the one who had walked up it. 7 years had passed since then. 7 years of work, of silence, of enduring. He rose before dawn and worked until he could no longer see his hands in the dark, and then he ate whatever his ranch hand Gus left warming on the stove, and then he slept, and then he rose again. He was 39 years old. He looked 50. Not because he was broken exactly, but because all the softness had been used up, spent, and what remained was pure function. He was capable and strong and utterly, completely alone. That was the man standing in his doorway on the 14th of November, 1882, when Nora Calloway stepped onto his porch and knocked twice on his door with the flat of her palm, because she had no knuckles left to spare. She had been walking for 3 hours. He opened the door because he heard the knocking, and because the rain outside had turned to something halfway between rain and sleet, a miserable half-frozen curtain of water that no sensible person would stand in for long. He expected one of his hands, or perhaps someone from Redstone with a message. He did not expect a young woman he had never seen before, maybe 24 or 25 years old, with a carpet bag hanging from one hand and the other pressed flat against his doorframe, as though the door itself was the only thing between her and falling. She was soaked through. Her dark hair, which had probably been pinned up at some point earlier in the day, hung in heavy ropes around her face. Her coat, a brown wool thing that had once been good quality, was so wet it had turned nearly black. Her boots, he noticed, were wrong for Montana in November. They were meant for city sidewalks, not creek crossings. She looked up at him, and her eyes were a very clear, very direct shade of brown, the color of creek water over smooth stones, and she said, without preamble or apology, "I know I am on your porch without being invited, and I am sorry for that, but I believe I twisted my ankle crossing the creek at the bottom of your south field, And if you send me back into that weather, I am going to have to strongly reconsider my opinion of men in general." He stared at her. She stared back, water running down the side of her nose, her jaw set with a kind of exhausted determination that he recognized, because it was the same expression he wore every morning when he got out of bed. He stepped aside. He did not say come in. He simply moved out of the doorway, which amounted to the same thing, and she came in, dragging her carpet bag and leaving a trail of water across his floorboards. He closed the door. The sound of the sleet died to a muffled hiss. She stood in the middle of his front room and looked around it, and he watched her take in the sparse furniture, the cold fireplace, the complete and total absence of any decoration or softness, and he watched her decide not to comment on it. She set her bag down carefully, like it contained something breakable. "My name is Nora Calloway," she said. "I am trying to reach the Delacroix homestead. I was told it was 6 miles north of Redstone. I may have been given incorrect directions." "The Delacroix homestead is 3 miles east," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended from lack of use more than anything. He cleared his throat. "Who gave you directions?" "A man at the stage depot." He had a great deal of confidence for someone who appeared to have never left town. Something shifted in Caleb's chest. Not a smile, nothing so dramatic as that. But the corners of his mouth made a small, involuntary movement, like a hinge that had not been used in a long time testing its own mechanism. "That would be Pete Hadley," he said. "I gathered from your expression that Pete Hadley is not known for his accuracy. Pete Hadley once gave a traveling salesman directions to Billings that ended with the man in Wyoming." Nora Calloway looked at him for a moment, water still dripping from her hair onto his floor, and then she said, "That is both funny and unfortunate. Is there somewhere I could sit?" He pointed at the chair near the fireplace. He moved to the hearth without being asked and began building a fire with the efficiency of long practice, stacking the kindling, striking the match, and feeding the first small flame until it caught and grew. He could feel her watching him. Most people found his silence uncomfortable. She did not seem to. She sat and she looked around the room and she pulled off her wet coat and draped it over her lap, and then she looked at her left boot with an expression of resigned suffering. "Do you need help with that?" he asked without turning from the fire. "I can manage," she said, and then made a sound of sharp pain that contradicted this. He turned. She had the boot half off and her face had gone pale. He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched down in front of her chair without asking, and wrapped one hand around her calf and the other around her heel, and eased the boot off with a slow, careful steadiness. She gripped the armrests of the chair and breathed through her nose and did not make another sound until the boot was clear, and then she let out a long breath like she had been holding it since the creak. The ankle was already swelling. Not broken, he thought, but badly turned. "Can you move your toes?" he said. She moved them. "Sprained," he said. "Not broken." "That is a relief," she said, "given that I need to get to the Delacroix place by tomorrow morning." "You are not going anywhere tonight," he said, and stood up, and the matter was settled in his mind before she could disagree. "The weather will not break before morning. The creek you crossed will be running too high to ford again before dawn." She looked at him steadily. "You are telling me I need to stay the night." "I am telling you what the weather and the creek are doing," he said. "What you do with that information is your business." She considered this for a moment and then said, "Then I will stay the night if you have room." "I have room," he said. He went to the kitchen to heat water for her to get warm, and he stood at the stove with his back to the front room, and he listened to the sleet against the windows and the crack of the growing fire, and he tried to remember the last time there had been another person in this house. A year, maybe. His ranch hand Gus came to the kitchen sometimes, but never beyond it. Caleb's neighbor, Warren Finch, had stopped by last spring to talk about a fence line dispute, but they had conducted that conversation on the porch. Before that, nobody. He carried the basin of hot water back to the front room and set it near her chair and said, "For your foot." She lowered her foot into the water, and the relief on her face was so open and unguarded that he had to look away from it. "You are very kind," she said. "I am practical," he said. "A guest with a bad ankle is inconvenient." "Is that what I am, a guest?" He looked at her again. She was watching him with a curious expression, not challenging exactly, but alert, the way a person looks when they are trying to understand something they have not quite worked out yet. "What else would you call yourself?" he said. "An inconvenience, apparently," she said, "but I appreciate the practicality." He almost smiled again. He did not. He asked her if she was hungry because the practical thing was to ask, and she said yes. So he heated the pot of stew Gus had left and brought her a bowl and bread, and she ate it with the quiet efficiency of someone who is genuinely starving, but was raised to have manners about it. He ate his own bowl standing at the kitchen counter and tried not to watch her through the doorway. While she ate, she told him what had brought her to Montana. She spoke plainly, without drama, as though she had already spent whatever emotion she had on the subject, and now she was just reporting facts. She had come from St. Louis. Her father had been a schoolteacher there, a good man who had died 14 months ago of a heart ailment, leaving her and her younger sister, Mabel, who was 16, in a house they could no longer afford. Nora had worked as a seamstress for a year, and Mabel had taken in washing, but it was not enough. The Delacroix family were cousins of their mother's side, distant but family nonetheless, and Harriet Delacroix had written to Nora 3 months ago to offer her a position helping with the household, and with tutoring the Delacroix children who were of school age and had no proper schooling available to them this far out. Mabel was to follow when Nora was settled. "So you are a schoolteacher," he said from the kitchen doorway. "I am my father's daughter," she said, "which amounts to the same thing. I never formally trained for it, but I know enough to teach the basics, and I like children. Do you know anyone in Redstone?" "Not a soul," she said, without any self-pity. "But I did not know anyone in St. Louis except my sister by the end of it. You get used to starting over." He looked at her, and something moved through him that he could not quite name, something uncomfortably close to recognition. "Where is your sister now?" he said. "Still in St. Louis, staying with a neighbor woman who was kind enough to take her in. I sent her my last 3 months of wages to keep her comfortable while I get established." She set her empty bowl on the side table. "She is 16 and she is sharp as a tack and she is going to be fine. I just need to get to the Delacroix place." "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed. He showed her to the spare room, which had been Clara's sewing room once and which still had a table in the corner that he had never moved. And he brought her an extra blanket from the chest in the hall, and he pointed out where the washroom was, and he said good night, and she said good night, and he went to his own room and lay on his back in the dark and listened to the sleet and thought about nothing in particular for a long time before he slept. The morning came cold and clear, the storm having wrung itself out sometime before dawn, and he was up before the sun as always, building the kitchen fire and putting water on for coffee. He heard her moving around in the spare room and then heard the careful, uneven step of someone favoring a bad ankle, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dress from the night before, her hair properly pinned, her face freshly washed, looking considerably more composed than the drenched creature who had appeared on his porch. "How is the ankle?" he said. "Better," she said. "Tender, but better." "Coffee, please." He poured 2 cups. He did not usually pour 2 cups. The second cup felt strange in his hand, a small weight that was somehow heavier than its size accounted for. She sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the window at the frost-white world outside, and he stood at the counter and drank his own coffee, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who were both accustomed to their own company, and therefore did not feel the need to fill space with noise. "I can drive you to the Delacroix place," he said. "I have business in that direction anyway." He did not have business in that direction. He was not sure why he said it. She looked at him over her cup. "That is very kind." "Practical," he said. "You use that word a great deal," she observed. "It is a useful word." "It is a word people use," she said carefully. when they want to be kind but do not want to be called kind. He had no response for that because it was accurate and he knew it. He turned back to the window and finished his coffee. He hitched the wagon while Gus, who was a round-faced, cheerful man of 45 with a white-speckled beard, openly stared at the sight of a young woman coming out of the ranch house with a carpet bag. Caleb watched Gus work very hard to keep his expression neutral and fail completely. "Morning," Gus said to Nora. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "You staying long?" Gus said with the elaborate casualness of a man who was asking exactly what he sounded like he was asking. "Gus," Caleb said from behind the near horse. "Just being neighborly," Gus said. "Miss Calloway is going to the Delacroix place," Caleb said. "I am driving her." Gus's expression went through several evolutions in quick succession. Caleb ignored all of them. The drive to the Delacroix homestead took 40 minutes over frozen ground, the wagon rattling along the track with Caleb at the reins and Nora sitting beside him with her carpet bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. The world around them was spectacular in the way that November Montana often is, every blade of grass encased in ice, the mountains to the south showing fresh white on their peaks, the sky a hard, clean blue that made everything below it look more vivid. Nora looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been told is beautiful but are only now understanding for themselves. "It is very big," she said. "Yes," he said. "The sky especially." "That is Montana," he said. "In St. Louis you could go weeks without seeing more than a strip of sky between the buildings," she said. "I did not realize until now how much I missed it. Open sky. You miss something you never had." She thought about this. "I think you can miss a thing you have not experienced yet, the way you might miss a person you have not met. There is a kind of longing that lives in you before it has an object." He looked at the road ahead and said nothing and thought about that for the rest of the drive. The Delacroix homestead was a tidy, two-story house with a large barn and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter under a layer of straw mulch. Harriet Delacroix came out onto the porch before the wagon had stopped moving, a solid, warm-faced woman in her 40s who descended the steps with her hands already reaching. "Nora, oh, we have been worried sick. We expected you yesterday evening." "I ran into a navigational difficulty," Nora said, climbing down from the wagon with care, "and was very fortunate to find shelter with your neighbor." She gestured toward Caleb. Harriet Delacroix's eyebrows rose. "Caleb Harrow drove you out." "He did," Nora said. Harriet Delacroix looked at Caleb with an expression he could not quite interpret, something between surprise and something warmer, and she said, "Thank you, Caleb, that was very good of you." "She twisted her ankle and the creek was up," he said, because this was the practical explanation. "It would have been irresponsible to send her back out." "Of course," Harriet said, still with that look. Caleb handed down Nora's bag from the wagon and Nora took it, and she looked up at him where he still sat in the wagon seat and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Harrow, for the fire and the stew and the roof." "Caleb," he said without knowing he was going to. She looked at him steadily. "Caleb," she said, "thank you." He nodded once and turned the wagon and drove back the way he had come. He thought about her the whole drive back. He was annoyed at himself for it. She was a practical young woman in a difficult situation doing what she needed to do to survive, and he had performed a basic human courtesy, and that was the beginning and end of it. There was nothing to think about. He made a deliberate effort to think about the fence line on the south pasture instead. It did not work. 3 days later, he went to Redstone for supplies, which was something he did every 2 or 3 weeks, and he had not planned to stop at the Delacroix place on the way back. But the Delacroix place was on the way back, and the drive was long, and when he passed the gate he found himself turning the wagon up the drive without quite having decided to do it. Nora was in the kitchen garden when he pulled up, wrapped in a heavy coat that fit better than the ruined one from 3 nights ago, turning the straw mulch with a garden fork to check on something underneath. She looked up when she heard the wagon and he felt absurdly as though he had been caught doing something he could not explain. "Mr. Harrow," she said, and then corrected herself. "Caleb." "I was passing," he said from the wagon seat. Of course, she said, without any of the skepticism the situation warranted. He climbed down and stood beside the wagon with his hat in his hands, which was a thing he had not done in years, and he said, "How is the ankle?" "Almost entirely healed," she said. "Harriet has been feeding me very well, which helps." "The children," he said. "4 of them," she said, leaning the garden fork against the fence post and coming toward him. "Robert is 11 and very serious. Lily is 9 and very not serious. The twins are 6 and are currently engaged in a project that involves a great deal of mud, which I am pretending not to know about." The corner of his mouth moved. "They are good children," she said, "and they are sharp. Robert especially. He is reading above where I expected." "You started teaching them already." "Monday," she said. "There is no point in waiting. Children fall behind so quickly if you leave them without structure." He looked at her, and she was looking back at him with that alert, curious expression she had, and the November sunlight was very thin and pale, but it caught the edge of her hair and turned it warm. "I brought you something," he said, and was immediately mortified, because that was not something he had planned to say, because he had not planned to stop here. But the thing was in the wagon, and he had put it there when he was in Redstone because he had seen it in the dry goods store and thought of her. And so he reached into the bed of the wagon and produced a pair of proper winter boots, Montana boots, with good thick soles and lacing to the mid-calf. She looked at them and then looked at him. "Your others are ruined," he said stiffly, "and the winter here is serious. You cannot be walking around the Delacroix property in those city shoes." She took the boots from him with both hands and looked down at them. Her expression was very controlled, but something moved through it, a kind of gratitude so sharp it bordered on pain, the gratitude of someone who has been managing alone for so long that even small kindnesses arrive like a blow. "How much do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I cannot accept. Consider it a practical matter," he said. "A schoolteacher with frostbitten feet is not much use to the Delacroix children." She looked up at him. "You are going to use that word every time you do something kind, aren't you?" "It is an accurate word." "It is a defense," she said, quietly and not unkindly, and with a directness that should have made him want to step back into the wagon and leave. It didn't. "Try them on," he said instead. "Make sure they fit." She sat on the garden fence to try them on, and they fit, because he had looked at her ruined boot before he went to Redstone, just for a moment to gauge the size. She laced them up and stood and walked back and forth a few steps, and something in her face broke open into a smile that was so genuine and full it was almost startling. "Oh, that is so much better," she said. He put his hat back on and turned back to the wagon. "Stay for coffee," she said. "Harriet would want me to ask. She is in town today, but she left a full pot." He stayed for coffee. He sat at the Delacroix kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and they talked for an hour, which was more than he had talked to another person in a single sitting in longer than he could clearly remember. She asked him about the ranch, and he found himself telling her about it, about the work of it, the way the cattle moved in winter, the way you had to read weather in the sky a full day before it arrived. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's classroom, about the way her father had believed, genuinely and without reservation, that a person who could read well could teach themselves anything else they needed to know. She said her father had taught her to love books with a kind of urgency, as though he already knew he would not be there to guide her for as long as he wanted. "He sounds like a good man," Caleb said. "The best I have ever known," she said simply. He thought about asking who else she had known men-wise and stopped himself. It was not his business. "Did you grow up in Montana?" she asked. "Ohio," he said. "Came out here in 1870. I was 27. "What made you come?" He looked at the window. "My wife wanted to see the mountains before she died." The words fell into the room, and he felt them land and was immediately sure he had made an error in saying them, an exposure he had not intended. He did not talk about Clara. He did not talk about any of it, but Nora did not fill the silence with the wrong kind of words. She did not say she was sorry, which was what people always said and which he had always found useless. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did she get to?" Something in his chest shifted. "Yes," he said, "she did." We came out on the train and we stayed at the Placer Hotel in Bozeman for 2 nights and we went up into the foothills, and she stood there for a long time just looking. Then she had that, Nora said. She had that, he agreed. He drove home in the late afternoon light with the mountains turning pink on their upper faces, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the silence of the drive was not entirely empty. The weeks that followed moved the way weeks move in deep winter in Montana, slowly, and with a great deal of cold and a great deal of work. Caleb found reasons to drive past the Delacroix place, reasons that he would not have been able to convincingly explain to anyone, least of all himself. A tool lent to Thomas Delacroix that needed returning. A message passed through by his neighbor Warren Finch for the Delacroix family. Once, purely by accident, he happened to arrive at the same time as a small crisis involving the twin boys, a frozen water trough, and a dog, and he stayed to help Thomas free the dog, and everyone ended up cold and laughing, or at least Thomas and Nora and the children were laughing. Caleb was not laughing, but his eyes had a different quality to them than usual, something lighter, something almost warm. Nora noticed. He could tell she noticed because she did not make a thing of it. He began to think about the fact that Christmas was coming. He had not marked Christmas in 7 years, not really. Gus and the other hands, Emmett and young Dale, spent Christmas in Redstone with the community gathering at the church, and Caleb had always stayed on the ranch alone and called it quiet time, called it rest. He had called it many things over the years except what it was, which was a man being unable to bear being in a room full of people who remembered what he used to look like when he was happy. But that year, Harriet Delacroix had organized a Christmas gathering at the Redstone Church, not just for the community but specifically because it was a way to raise funds for a proper school building, which the town had been trying to accomplish for 4 years. It was Nora's idea, he later learned, the fundraising piece of it. She had suggested it to Harriet 2 weeks after arriving, and Harriet had immediately run with it. And now the whole of Redstone and the surrounding ranches were talking about a Christmas celebration, with music and food and a collection taken up for the school fund. Gus told him about it on a Tuesday morning while they were mending a section of fence in the north pasture. "I expect you won't be going," Gus said in the tone of a man who was phrasing a question as a statement to see if it would be corrected. "I have not decided," Caleb said. Gus dropped his hammer. He picked it up. He looked very carefully at the fence post and did not look at Caleb. "That's so," Gus said. "The fence," Caleb said. "Right," said Gus. "The fence." Caleb went to the Christmas gathering. He told himself he went because it was for the school fund, and a proper school would be good for the community, and a good community made for a stable territory, and a stable territory was good for ranching. He got dressed in his good black coat that he had not worn in some years, and found that it still fit, and he rode into Redstone on a cold, clear December evening with a pale quarter moon rising over the mountains and the light from the church windows spilling out gold onto the snow. The church hall was crowded and warm, smelling of pine boughs and wood smoke, and the particular combination of people and their best soap. Someone was playing piano in the corner, not well but with enthusiasm, and there were children running through the crowd in ways that suggested their parents had given up on managing them for the evening. Caleb stood in the doorway longer than was strictly dignified, feeling like a bear that has wandered into someone's house and is not sure of its welcome. He found Nora near the window on the far side of the room, talking to Robert Delacroix and apparently showing him something in a book she was holding, because Robert was leaning over it with his eyebrows furrowed in deep concentration. She had on a dark blue dress that he had not seen before, nicer than her working clothes, with a collar of cream-colored lace, and her hair was pinned up more carefully than usual with a few small pieces framing her face. She looked, quite simply, lovely, and Caleb stood across the crowded room and looked at her for a moment before he had thought to stop himself doing so. Robert pointed to something in the book. Nora nodded and said something, and Robert's face cleared into understanding, and he said something back that made her smile. That full, unguarded smile that Caleb had seen once in the kitchen garden, and he felt it the same way he had felt it then, like a fist opening in the middle of his chest. He made his way across the room. He was stopped twice by neighbors who seemed genuinely surprised to see him, and he answered their questions about the ranch with the minimum necessary words and kept moving. When he reached the window, Robert had been claimed by his mother, and Nora looked up from closing the book and saw him. "Caleb," she said, and the surprise and pleasure in her voice were equally distributed, which undid something in him. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Nora," she said, as she had told him twice before. "You came." "I came," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment with a searching quality, as though she were reading something in him that she was not entirely sure of yet. Then she said, "The collection this evening will go to the school fund. We have already raised enough for materials. The question is labor." "I can provide labor," he said. "My hands can spare a week in February. The building is not complicated if you keep the design simple." She stared at him. "You would do that?" "A school is a practical do not," she said. "Say practical." He looked at her for a long moment, and the warmth of the room and the sound of the piano and the smell of the pine boughs were all around them, and he said, with more honesty than he was comfortable with, "A school is a good thing. I believe in good things, even when I am not very good at saying so." Something shifted in her expression, something that went deep and soft and stayed there. "I think," she said, "that you are better at saying things than you believe you are. You just need to believe it's worth saying them." They stood together for a while and talked about the school and about Redstone, and about one or two other things that he could not afterwards recall precisely, because he was too occupied with the way she talked, the way she looked at him when he spoke, with full attention, as though what he said mattered regardless of whether it was especially interesting. And he thought that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her, that she paid attention. Later in the evening there was a collection taken up, and after that the piano player was joined by a man with a fiddle, and people began to dance. Caleb had been planning to leave. He had been planning to leave for 20 minutes when Harriet Delacroix materialized at his elbow and said, in the voice of a woman who is not making a suggestion, "Caleb Harrow, there is a young woman who has danced exactly once this evening, and she is standing by herself over there looking like she is too proud to look lonely." He looked. Nora was standing near the wall with a cup of punch, watching the dancers with the expression of someone who is trying very hard to look as though they do not mind not dancing. "I do not dance," Caleb said. "You used to," Harriet said, and walked away. He stood there for a moment, and then he crossed the room and he stood in front of Nora and he held out his hand and he said, "I should warn you that I am not good at this." She looked at his hand and then at his face. "Neither am I," she said. "We can be bad at it together." She put her hand in his. They were, in fact, both rather bad at it. They got the steps wrong at least 4 times, and once nearly collided with Thomas Delacroix and his wife. And once Nora laughed at something Caleb did wrong with his feet. And the laugh was so unexpected and genuine that it startled him into the closest thing to a laugh he had produced in 7 years. A short, rough sound that he barely recognized as coming from himself. It surprised him so much that he stumbled, and she caught his arm to steady him, and for a moment they were very close together, her hand on his arm, his hand at her waist, and the music went on around them and neither of them moved. "Are you all right?" she said. "Fine," he said. And then, because something had to be said, "I have not laughed in a long time." She looked at him with those creek-water eyes and said, "I know, I could tell the first time I made you almost do it." "Is that a thing you set out to do?" he asked. "A little," she admitted without apology. "You looked like you could use it." He held her gaze and could not think of a single thing to say, and the music swelled and they began moving again, less badly this time. He drove home that night with the cold stars sharp overhead and the mountains dark against the sky, and he sat in the wagon and let the horse find its own way along the familiar track, and he thought about a hand in his and a laugh he had not laughed and the way she had said, "I know, I could tell," as though she had been watching him carefully from the beginning. as though he had been, without knowing it, someone worth watching. He did not sleep particularly well, but not for bad reasons. January came in hard and mean, with 3 weeks of temperatures that sent the cattle crowding together in the low shelter ground, and kept Caleb and his hands working longer hours than usual to make sure the water troughs were broken clear of ice, and the hay was distributed, and the herd was accounted for. It was brutal, consuming work, and he was grateful for it because it left very little room in his head for anything else, and the anything else he needed less room for was a specific woman's face and a specific moment on a crowded dance floor. He saw her twice in January. Once when he came to Redstone for supplies and encountered her outside the dry goods store, and they stood in the street in the bitter cold for 15 minutes talking about the school building plans, and whether the east-facing windows should be 3 or 4, and whether pine or fir would hold better as flooring. Once when he stopped at the Delacroix place to return a tool and found her reading to the children by the fire, and she looked up when he came in with a warmth so immediate and undefended that he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. In February, as promised, he and his 3 hands spent a week helping build the Redstone schoolhouse. 6 other men from the surrounding area also came, and by Friday they had a simple, solid building with a floor and 4 walls and a roof that would not leak, and Nora Calloway walked through the empty room and ran her hand along the new plain desk surface, and her face had in it everything that her father's face must have had when he believed in the education of children. "It is perfect," she said. "It is basic," Caleb said from the doorway, but without his usual force. "Perfect does not mean elaborate," she said. "It means exactly right for what it needs to be." He looked at her standing in the thin February light from those east-facing windows, 4 of them, as they had decided, and something moved in his chest that was no longer just warmth or recognition. It was something older and more serious and considerably more frightening. He left before he had to look at it directly, but things were already in motion that could not be unmoved. The school opened in March, and with it came a change in the rhythm of Nora's days, as she was now teaching 5 days a week in Redstone instead of at the Delacroix table. And so, she traveled the 3 miles into town each morning and 3 miles back each afternoon, on the horse that Thomas Delacroix had lent her, a steady brown mare named Agnes who had the particular quality of being both reliable and dull, which Nora said was exactly what she needed in a horse, given that she was still not entirely confident about riding. Caleb found this out on a Tuesday in mid-March when he came to Redstone for business at the land office and found her, at the end of the school day, attempting to convince Agnes to move away from the post outside the schoolhouse and in the direction of home. Agnes was not moving. Agnes had found a patch of bare ground that was showing the first thin green hints of spring grass, and she was not interested in leaving it. "She respects you more when you sound certain," Caleb said, from behind her. Nora turned around. "She respects no one," she said. "She is anarchic." "She is eating," he said. "Let her finish." He leaned against the schoolhouse wall and waited with her, and when Agnes had finished her grass and decided to be amenable again, he adjusted Nora's stirrup which had been set at the wrong length. "There," he said, stepping back. "That will be easier on your knee." She looked down at him from the saddle, and the angle put her slightly above him, which was new, and something about it was different from all the other times she had looked at him. "Caleb," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why do you come by as often as you do?" He put his hand on the horse's neck and looked at the mane and said, "I come to Redstone regularly." "You come past the schoolhouse," she said, "when the land office and the store are both on the other end of town." He was quiet. "I am not complaining," she said quickly and then more slowly. "I am the opposite of complaining." He looked up at her. The March light was still pale, but there was more warmth in it than there had been for months, and the mud of the street smelled of the specific promise of spring, and her eyes were very serious and very clear. "I like talking to you," he said, which was a thing he had not said to another person since Clara and which cost him something considerable to say. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I like talking to you too, very much. She held his gaze. I thought you should know that. He nodded once, because words had temporarily failed him. I will see you soon, she said. Soon, he agreed. She rode home. He stood in the street in the mud of early spring and watched her go and felt, with a clarity that was at once terrifying and undeniable, that something was happening to him that he had believed was no longer possible. Something was coming back to life in him that had been sealed off and dark for 7 years. And like any living thing returning after a long winter, it was tender and overwhelmed and not at all sure what to do with itself. April brought warmer days and the particular madness of calving season, which consumed Caleb's life entirely for 3 weeks. He slept in 4-hour shifts when he slept at all, and he and his hands took turns watching the herd through the cold nights, because a first-time heifer in trouble in the dark was a thing that required human presence. He lost 3 calves and saved 2 dozen, and by the end of it, his hands were raw and his back ached at a new, interesting depth, and he felt the particular satisfaction of having done hard work well. He had seen Nora only twice in those 3 weeks, brief encounters in Redstone, and both times he had been too exhausted to say anything particularly interesting. But she had looked at him with a kind of focused concern that said she understood about calving season, probably because she had asked Thomas Delacroix about it and paid attention to the answer. When calving season ended, he cleaned himself up and rode to the Delacroix place on a Sunday afternoon in late April, when the wildflowers were coming up on the south-facing hillsides and the air smelled of new grass, and he found Nora on the porch grading papers. She was wearing a light cotton dress because the afternoon was genuinely warm, the first real warmth of the year, and she had taken off her shoes and was sitting with her feet tucked under her on the porch chair, and she looked startled and pleased when she heard his horse. Calving is done, he said, swinging down. I heard, she said. Harriet said it went well overall. Well enough, he said. He tied the horse to the post and came up the porch steps and stood there a moment. I have a request. She raised her eyebrows. On Sunday next I am riding up to the foothills to check the upper pasture fence before I move the cattle up for summer. There is a particular view from up there that is, he stopped and started again. It is a view that is worth the ride. I thought if you were not engaged you might want to see it. She looked at him for a very long moment. Are you asking me to go riding with you, Caleb? She said. I am asking if you want to see the view, he said, and then, because she deserved more than that and he knew it, yes. I'm asking you to go riding with me. She set the papers on the table beside her chair. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. He rode back to the Double H with something moving in his chest that he had been gradually learning to accept was the return of something he had thought gone forever. It felt strange and a little dangerous and entirely worth the risk. The Sunday ride was long. 2 hours up into the foothills on a trail Caleb knew by memory, through aspen groves that were just coming into new leaf, pale green and trembling in the light breeze, and through open meadows where the ground was soft underfoot with melted snow, and the first wild hyacinth was blooming in pale purple patches. He brought 2 horses, his own big gray stallion Trace and Agnes, who was less dull on a trail than she was on the road, apparently having more opinions about open country. Nora rode better than she had let on. She was not confident exactly, but she was attentive and responsive, and she listened when Caleb said something about Agnes's preferences, and she did not try to override the horse but worked with her, which was exactly right. They did not talk much on the climb. The trail was narrow in places and it required attention, and besides, the silence was one of the good kinds, full of the sound of hooves on soft ground and the creek running fast with snowmelt and the occasional conversation of birds in the aspens. The view, when they reached it, was a wide southwest-facing slope that opened suddenly out of the tree line and gave a full, unobstructed view of the valley below and the full range of the Beartooth beyond it, the peaks still half-white, the lower slopes going green, the river glinting in the valley 1,000 feet down. The sky above was the deep, particular blue of a clear Montana spring day, with 3 hawks riding the thermals in wide, unhurried circles. Nora stopped Agnes and sat very still. Caleb stopped Trace beside her and waited. She looked at it for a long time. He looked at her looking at it. "Clara," he said quietly, "when she stood in the foothills and looked at the mountains, this is what she looked like." Nora turned to him. Her eyes were wet, which she did not seem to mind. "You do not have to tell me about her if it hurts," she said. "It hurts less than it used to," he said. "I think that is allowed." "It is absolutely allowed," she said. He looked back at the mountains. "She would have liked you," he said. "She liked direct people, people who said what they meant. That is a very kind thing to say. It is an honest thing," he said, "which I prefer." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I say something honest?" "Yes," he said. "I am falling in love with you," she said, very directly and very calmly, as though she had decided that if it was true it was worth saying clearly. "I am telling you because I think you deserve to know, and because I think perhaps you feel something similar, and I do not want either of us to spend the summer going around it when we could simply acknowledge it." The hawks continued their circles. The mountains did not move. He looked at her for a long time. This woman on her borrowed horse with the spring valley behind her and her eyes steady, and her hands patient on the reins. And he thought of 7 years of sealed rooms and empty Sundays, and the particular hollowness of a house with no light in it. And he thought of a woman on a rainy porch who had said she was sorry about her intrusion with no apology in her voice whatsoever. And he thought about a laugh he had not laughed in 7 years, and how she had said, "I know. I could tell." "I feel something similar," he said. "Considerably more than something similar," she exhaled. "Good," she said. "It frightens me," he said, because it did, and she deserved that honesty too. "I know," she said. "I can tell, but you are doing it anyway." "Yes," he said. She reached across the distance between their horses and put her hand on his arm briefly and then moved it back. It was enough. They rode back down through the aspens and the meadows in the spring afternoon, and at the bottom of the trail he helped her down from Agnes, which was something horses required because the dismount was steep, and his hands were at her waist and hers were at his shoulders, and when her feet touched the ground, they were standing very close together, and he looked at her face for a moment, and then he bent his head and kissed her once, carefully, as though she were something fragile, which she was not. And she kissed him back with more certainty than he had managed, which felt exactly right. They rode to the Delacroix house in the late afternoon, with the valley turning gold around them and without further declarations, because everything necessary had been said, and the rest could be built with time. May and June moved differently after that. There was a rhythm to it, an understanding between them that had been spoken clearly and did not need constant renegotiation. He rode to the Delacroix place on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, and she came to the Double H once, with Harriet as her company for the proprieties, and walked around the property with him and asked serious questions about the cattle operation, and listened to his answers with the same full attention she gave everything. She told him about St. Louis, about growing up in a house full of books, about the way her father had taught her that being a woman in this world was not an excuse to ask less of it. She told him about her mother, who had died when Nora was 12, and about the years after, learning to run a household and take care of Mabel while also going to school. She told him things in the easy, natural way that comes when you have decided to trust someone, and he told her things back in the harder, slower way that comes when you are not used to trusting and are doing it anyway. He told her, one Wednesday evening in June when they were sitting on the Double H porch in the warm dusk with the first fireflies beginning in the long grass, about the night Ellie died. He had not told anyone about that night. Not Gus, not Warren Finch, not the doctor who had come too late. He told Nora in a low voice with his eyes on the mountains, and she sat beside him and she listened, and she did not offer anything except her presence, which was exactly the right offering, and at the end of it she put her hand over his and left it there. She was 4, he said. She still had that baby roundness in her face. She had Clara's eyes. Tell me something she used to do, Nora said. Something small, he thought. She used to collect pebbles, kept them in her apron pocket. Every time I'd pick her up, she'd make a clinking sound like she was carrying treasure. Nora made a sound that was not quite a word, but that contained everything. He turned his hand over under hers so that their palms were together. I have been afraid, he said, of caring for someone again. I know, she said. I am still afraid, he said. I know, she said. But you are here. I am here, he said. He kissed her on that porch in the summer dusk with the fireflies in the grass and the mountains dark against the orange sky, and it was nothing like the brief, careful first kiss on the mountain trail. It was slow and certain, and full of everything that had been building since a rainy November evening when she had stood on his porch uninvited, and told him she was reconsidering her opinion of men in general. In July, Nora's sister Mabel arrived from St. Louis. The letter had come in late June, a week earlier than Nora had expected, saying that Mabel was coming on the 19th of July, and the day the stage rolled into Redstone with Nora Calloway among its passengers was a day of particular chaos. The stage was late. Mabel's bag had been sent to the wrong relay station and arrived 2 days after she did. And Mabel herself, who was 16 and who had clearly absorbed the same direct speaking quality as her sister while also adding a particular sharply observed wit that was entirely her own, took one look at Caleb standing beside Nora in the Redstone Street and said, "So you are the rancher." "I'm a rancher," Caleb said. "Nora's letters have been very informative," Mabel said, and looked at her sister with the look of someone who has read between the lines of several letters very successfully. Nora, for the first time in Caleb's experience, looked slightly flustered. "Your bag is at the relay station," Nora said, "and we will deal with that tomorrow." "I am fine," Mabel said, still looking at Caleb with an expression of frank assessment. "Do you have any books?" He blinked. "Books. Books." "At your ranch. Nora says you live alone, and I am wondering if you are the kind of person who lives without books, because that tells you a great deal about a person." "Mabel," Nora said. "I have books," Caleb said. "Not many, but what I have is good." Mabel seemed to find this satisfactory. "All right," she said, and picked up her smaller bag that she had kept with her on the stage. "Lead on." Mabel moved into the Delacroix house with Nora, and within a week had made herself genuinely useful by helping with the youngest Delacroix children and assisting Nora with the schoolhouse preparations for the fall term. She was sharp and observant, and she had a particular way of saying exactly what she thought that Caleb found, after an initial period of mild alarm, to be enormously refreshing. She told him, on one of his Sunday visits, that she had been worried about Nora. Before she left St. Louis, Mabel said, they were on the Delacroix porch, the three of them, Nora having gone inside to help Harriet with something. She was wearing out, doing everything herself. She never complained, she would not have, but she was carrying too much. "She is capable," Caleb said. "She is the most capable person I have ever met," Mabel said. "That is not the point. The point is that being capable does not mean you should have to carry everything alone." He looked at this 16-year-old girl with Nora's direct eyes and her own sharpness, and he said, "No, it does not." "She is happy here," Mabel said. "Happier than I have seen her in a long time." "I think some of that is you. Some of it is Montana," he said. "Some," Mabel agreed, "is Montana." August came with its particular blazing heat and the smell of dry grass and the cattle moving slow in the afternoons, and the evenings long and warm and full of the sound of crickets. Caleb began repairs on the double H house that he had been putting off, not because they were urgently necessary, but because he found himself thinking about what the house could be if it were not so empty. He replaced the front porch boards, which had been getting soft. He repaired the chimney in the front room. He did not do these things with any explicit intention. He did them because the house deserved to be proper. Gus watched all of this with the expression of a man who is choosing not to say anything on the grounds that anything he said would be wrong. One evening in late August, Caleb was on the porch doing the repairs when Nora rode up alone. She had become more confident on horseback by then, and Agnes had developed a more agreeable character under her regular company, or at least had decided that some people were worth being reasonable for. Nora swung down competently and tied Agnes to the post and came up the porch steps and looked at what he was doing. "New boards," she said. "The old ones were going soft." She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Caleb, I want to say something and I would like you to hear it without immediately calling it practical." He set down his hammer. "All right. I want to stay," she said, "in Montana, not because of the Delacroix family, though I am grateful to them, not because of the school, though I love the school. I want to stay because of you, and I think you know that, and I think you know what I am asking." He looked at her in the August evening with the last light turning everything copper and gold, and the mountains standing up blue and firm in the south. "I am asking if you want that too," she said. "Not just the Sunday rides and the Wednesday evenings. I'm asking if you want to build something permanent." He got up off his knees where he had been crouching over the porch boards, and he stood in front of her and he said, "I have been afraid of asking you because I thought it was too soon. I thought you might think I was moving faster than was decent." "It has been 9 months," she said, "and we are not 20. Or rather, you are not 20 and I am not a child. We know our own minds." "I know my mind," he said. "I have known my mind since January, if I am honest." "Then ask," she said, "will you marry me, Nora?" He said, which was not preceded by a long speech or accompanied by a ring, because he did not have one and had not thought that far ahead, because he had not expected the conversation to happen today, standing on his half-repaired porch in his work clothes. "I know the house needs work. I know I am not always easy to be with. I know that I spent a long time." "Yes," she said, "I am not done." "Caleb," she said, "I have said yes. You can finish your speech afterwards." He stopped talking. He looked at her. She was smiling, that full, unguarded smile, and it hit him the same way it had the first time, like a fist opening in his chest. And this time he let it. And this time something else opened too, something that had been sealed for 7 long years, and he felt it go with a sensation that was so much more relief than pain that he almost had to sit down. He reached out and touched her face carefully with one rough hand, and she leaned into it and closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said again, quietly, just to confirm. They were married in October, in the Redstone church, with Gus standing up as Caleb's witness and Mabel standing up for Nora, and the whole of Redstone in attendance, because the whole of Redstone had been watching the progression of this particular courtship with a communal investment that bordered on the civic. Harriet Delacroix wept openly, and Thomas Delacroix shook Caleb's hand for a long time without saying anything, which Caleb understood perfectly. The church had pine boughs on the altar and autumn wildflowers in jars along the windowsills, because it was October, and that was what October in Montana offered. And Nora wore a dress that Harriet had helped her make, a deep golden brown that suited the season and suited her. And she walked up the aisle with Mabel at her side because she had no father to walk with her, and she had decided, with characteristic directness, that she would walk herself. Caleb stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and he felt something in his face do something unfamiliar, a warmth moving through it that he recognized only dimly as the return of an expression that had been absent for 7 years. Not a full smile, not yet, not quite, but the precursor to it, the feeling that was behind it, the sense that the world contained something worth smiling at. The minister said the words and they said their words back, and when he was told to kiss his bride he did, and the church made the sounds that churches make at such moments, and Gus, behind him, made a sound that was either a cheer or a sob and might have been both simultaneously. Afterwards there was a celebration at the church hall, with proper dancing and a great deal of food, and the fiddle player from the Christmas gathering, who was considerably better this time around, and Caleb danced with his wife, and he was not particularly bad at it this time. They danced for a long time. Mabel danced with Robert Delacroix, who was 12 now and very serious and clearly not sure what to do with this information, and later danced enthusiastically and badly with several other young people, and seemed perfectly happy. Late in the evening, with the party still going around them, Caleb and Nora stood near the door, and he had his arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into him with her head against his jaw, and he could feel her breathing and feel the warmth of her, and he looked around the room full of people and firelight and sound. "I was not going to come tonight," Gus said, appearing at his elbow, referring to the Christmas gathering of the previous year. "I mean, I was. But I thought about whether to tell you about it for a week." "You made the right decision," Caleb said. "I usually do," Gus said, with tremendous satisfaction, and walked away. Nora lifted her head and looked up at him and smiled. He smiled back. It was a real one, full and unguarded, something he had not felt on his own face in so long it startled him, that smile arriving like a season he had stopped expecting. "There it is," she said softly. "There what is," he said. "I was wondering," she said, "what that looked like." He looked at her and he kept smiling helplessly, because it turned out that was the sort of thing her presence had become for him, inevitable and unstoppable, and he bent his head and kissed her hair and thought that the night Clara had died, if someone had told him that there would be a night like this one, he would not have believed them. He was glad he had been wrong. They went home to the Double H that night, to the house with the new porch boards and the repaired chimney, and the front room where the fire had been lit by Gus in advance, thoughtfully, and the spare room that was no longer a spare room because Nora had already moved some of her things in the week before, and the house was warm and full of the smell of wood smoke, and it was so completely different from the sealed, empty thing it had been that it felt almost like a different place. Nora stood in the front room and looked at the fire and said, "We should get a rug. That floor is very cold in the morning." "We should get a rug," he agreed, "and possibly curtains, if you like." She turned around and looked at him with the firelight behind her and her wedding dress catching the gold of it, and she said, "I am going to make this house absolutely full of things." "Good," he said. "It has been empty long enough." She crossed the room to him, and he held her for a long time in the firelight without speaking, and outside the October wind moved through the Montana grass, and the mountains stood in the dark, and the cottonwood on the low hill east of the barn, the one with the graves beneath it, turned in the wind and was still. He thought of Clara and he thought of Ellie, and he held them in his mind the way you hold a lantern against the dark, carefully, not to put them out but to see by them. And he thought that loving Nora was not the opposite of loving them. He thought it was what came after, what was possible after, if a man was willing to stop sealing the windows. Winter came again. The second winter with Nora in it, and the first as his wife, and the house was different in all the ways she had promised it would be. There was a rug, a good braided one in shades of blue and brown that she and Harriet had made together over 3 evenings in November. There were curtains on the front room windows, a practical dark wool that kept the cold out. There were books on the shelf, her father's books that Mabel had brought out from St. Louis when she came, and a few new ones that Nora had ordered from the bookseller in Billings. There was the smell of good cooking from the kitchen because Nora had, with Gus's interested advice, taken over the cooking herself and had turned out to be considerably better at it than Gus, a fact that Gus acknowledged with the same philosophical good humor he brought to everything. There was sound in the house. The sound of her moving through it, the sound of the pages of books, the sound of her talking to Gus in the kitchen about the stew, the sound of her laughter, which was the best sound he had ever heard, and which he was becoming helplessly addicted to producing on purpose. He told her jokes. He was not particularly good at jokes, but he told them anyway, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, and when she laughed he felt like he had done something genuinely important. She told him about her students and the school, which she now ran as Redstone's first proper schoolteacher, in the building they had built. She told him about Robert Delacroix, who was 13 now, and had begun working through a reader 2 grades above his age group. She told him about the youngest children, who were learning their letters with the particular mix of effort and delight that children bring to things that are hard but possible, and her face when she talked about them had the same warmth and certainty as her father's must have had, the conviction that this work mattered. In March, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, over coffee, directly, without preamble, in the way she told him everything. He sat with this for a moment. He was aware of a complicated feeling, joy and fear arriving together, as they do when you have loved and lost and are being asked to love again. She watched him. "Say something," she said. "I'm trying to find the right words," he said. "Are you happy?" she asked, and her voice was steady but her eyes were anxious, which was the first time he had seen her anxious, and it moved him considerably. "I am terrified," he said, "and I am happier than I have been since before I knew what loss was." He looked at her. "Both things at once," she exhaled. "Both things at once," she agreed. "That is about right." He reached across the table and took her hand. "We are going to do this properly," he said. "We are going to take care of each other." "We already are," she said. Mabel, when she was told, produced a sound that startled everyone in the Delacroix kitchen, where the announcement was made on Sunday. Harriet Delacroix embraced Nora for a long time. Thomas Delacroix shook Caleb's hand with a particular firmness that said more than words. Gus, told the following morning in the barn, sat down on a hay bale and stared at the wall for a moment and then said, very quietly, "Well, that is the best news." And Caleb nodded, and they went back to work and did not discuss it further because they were both men of a particular kind. But the thing had been acknowledged, and that was sufficient. The summer of 1883 was long and warm and good, with enough rain early in the season to bring the grass up thick, and the cattle fat, and the calving numbers from the spring already better than the year before. The Double H was running well. Caleb had hired a fourth hand, a young man named Jose Espinoza, who had come up from Texas, and who was the best rider Caleb had ever employed, and who had a natural way with the cattle that Caleb recognized as something unteachable, the thing that is simply in you, or it is not. Nora continued teaching through June and took the summer off, as the school did not run through the full summer months. She spent the time doing the things she had accumulated plans for all year: a proper kitchen garden behind the house, a new bookshelf built with Caleb's help that took up an entire wall of the front room, a series of letters to education offices in Helena advocating for better support for rural schoolteachers, which she had been writing since the previous fall with a calm, relentless persistence that he recognized as the same energy she brought to everything. In the evenings of that summer, they would sit on the porch he had repaired, and she would read, and he would work on some piece of leather or metal work that needed doing, and the sunset would develop and deepen over the mountains, and the grass would move in the long light, and she would sometimes look up from her book and just look at the mountains for a while, and he would watch her do it and feel, in those moments, something so complete that he would not have known how to describe it to anyone and did not try. He thought sometimes about the night she had arrived on that porch, wet to the bone and leaning on his doorframe, and he thought about the strange chance of it, Pete Hadley's wrong directions, the high creek, the sprained ankle, all the small accidents that had conspired to put a woman he had not known existed in front of him at the precise moment when, perhaps, he was just barely capable of being reached again. He did not believe in coincidence exactly, but he believed in grace in the sense of something unearned arriving when most needed, and he supposed that was close enough. In late August, Mabel came to stay at the Double H for a week to help as the baby's arrival grew closer, because Nora was uncomfortable and tired in the heat, and Mabel was capable and practical in her own direct way and refused to hear any argument about it. The night the baby came was a September night, the 2nd of September, 1883, cool and clear with a frost already threatening, and Harriet Delacroix came and the doctor from Redstone came, a capable man named Dr. Albright, who had been practicing in Montana for 15 years, and Caleb spent 3 hours on the porch because that was where the men went and he knew it, and also because the porch was the right place to be, the place where things had begun, where Nora had first stood with her wet hair and her carpet bag, and her refusal to be apologetic about intruding. He sat on the porch steps in the cold September dark, and he looked at the stars, which were extraordinary, and he held, with some difficulty, the fear that comes from having once lost and now loving again. He held it and he breathed through it, and at some point in the third hour Gus came and sat beside him on the steps without a word, and they sat together in the dark, and that helped. And then Mabel appeared in the doorway with her hair coming loose and her sleeves rolled up and her face radiant, and she said, "Caleb, you have a son." He went inside. He sat in the chair beside the bed where Nora lay, looking exhausted and entirely herself, and she held the baby against her, a small, impossibly determined-looking creature with a full head of dark hair, and she looked up at Caleb when he came in, and her face was every good thing at once. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms carefully, and he held the child, his son, who weighed very little and felt very solid at the same time, the way new things do, and he looked down at this small face and felt something happen to his own face that was beyond his control. He was crying. He was aware of this distantly, the way you are aware of weather happening around you. He had not cried in 7 years, not once, not since the hill east of the barn, and now he was holding his son in the front room of a house that had been empty and cold for 7 years and was neither of those things anymore, and the feeling that moved through him was enormous and beyond any word he had been given. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby's eyes, unfocused and ancient, moved toward the sound of his voice. Nora put her hand on his arm and left it there, and he looked at her over the baby's head and could not speak, and she understood, because she always understood, and she smiled. "Hello," he said again, to both of them. They named the boy Thomas Henry Harrow, Thomas for Thomas Delacroix, who had been a consistent and quiet kindness during all of the past year, and Henry for Nora's father, Henry Calloway, the schoolteacher who had believed that reading was the beginning of everything. They called him Henry in daily life, because Nora said Thomas was a fine Sunday name, but Henry was what fit the face. Henry Harrow was a loud, enthusiastic infant, and then a loud, enthusiastic young child, with his mother's directness and his father's determination, and the good fortune of inheriting both parents' strong constitutions. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 13 full sentences that surprised everyone except Nora, who had expected it. And by the time he was 2, he had opinions about things and communicated them without reservation. Gus adored him. Jose taught him at age 3 to sit on the paddock fence and watch the horses without making noise, which was the first horse lesson, and Henry took it with uncharacteristic silence and enormous seriousness, and afterward informed his father that he was going to have a horse. "When you can reach the stirrup," Caleb said. "That is not very far away," Henry said. Caleb looked at this small, serious child with his mother's eyes, and something moved through him that he had by now learned to simply receive without trying to name it, the warmth of it, the particular completeness of a man who is surrounded by people who love him and loves them back with everything he has. He had learned to do that, to receive it. It had taken time, and it had cost him something, that learning, but it was the most valuable thing he had done. In the winter of 1884, when Henry was 15 months old and Mabel was 17, and had been corresponding with the Territorial Education Office in Helena about funding for rural schools, a letter came from Helena that announced a small grant for exactly the Redstone school building Nora had been advocating for. Nora sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice and then put it down and said nothing for a moment. "Good news or bad?" Caleb said from the doorway. "They approved the grant," she said. "For a second room, we can expand the school." He watched her face take this in, the way it moved through surprise and then gratitude and then something settled and certain, the expression of a person whose work has been recognized and who will go on doing it regardless but finds in the recognition a particular renewal. "Your father would be glad," he said. She looked up at him. "He would," she said. "He would be sitting right here being insufferably pleased." Insufferably. He had his moments, she said, smiling. He came to the table and sat across from her and picked up the letter and read it himself, and they talked about the expansion for an hour, about where the second room should be positioned, about whether they needed a second teacher now, and if so, where they would find one, about whether Mabel might eventually train as a teacher herself. She is going to Helena, Nora said, which was apparently news she had been carrying for a while. She wrote to me last week. She has been offered a position assisting in an office there, and she wants to take evening classes at the academy. Mabel in Helena, he said. I know, Nora said. The city will not know what hit it. He laughed fully, the kind of laugh that came easily to him now, the kind he had not been capable of for 7 years and which had come back so completely that he sometimes forgot, for long stretches of time, that it had ever been gone. She will be fine, he said. She will be magnificent, Nora said, and she believed it fully, and she was right. By the spring of 1885, the Double H had grown to 550 head, and Caleb had taken on a fifth hand, and the new room at the Redstone School had been built in a single concentrated week of community labor, much like the first building, with Caleb and Jose and Emmett all working alongside Thomas Delacroix and 4 other men from the surrounding area. The school now had 23 enrolled students from 6 families, and the territorial inspector, who came through in April, called it the finest rural school he had visited that year, which Nora received with grace and immediately turned into a letter to the education office, advocating for 3 other rural schools in the territory that were not yet as well supported. Nora was 5 months pregnant with their second child in that spring, and was teaching right up until the end of the school year in June, at which point she handed her classes over to the assistant teacher she had trained over the winter, a quiet, meticulous woman named Mrs. Connors, who had come out from Iowa and who had turned out to be a remarkably good fit for the school's particular culture. Their second child arrived in August of 1885, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, after the woman on the hill east of the barn, after the woman who had stood in the foothills and looked at the mountains. They named her Clara, and they called her Clara, and the name felt, in Caleb's mouth, no longer like a wound but like a flower pressed between pages, something preserved and honored and given forward into new life. Henry, who was 2, inspected Clara with the thoroughness of a rancher inspecting a new acquisition and declared her acceptable. He did love her, eventually and completely, with a fierceness that became characteristic of him as he grew, protective and loyal and occasionally overbearing, all of which Nora said he had gotten from his father, which Caleb could not entirely dispute. The Double H in those years was a working ranch, and a home in the full sense of that word, busy and loud and demanding and warm. Gus had become a permanent fixture, less a hired hand than a member of the household, with his own chair in the kitchen, and an ongoing argument with Nora about the correct way to season a stew that had been running for 2 years. Jose had become Caleb's most trusted man, and had been given responsibility for the horse breeding program that Caleb had begun expanding in 1884, because Jose's eye for horseflesh was extraordinary, and it seemed the right use of a gift. The evenings were the best part. The evenings when the work was done, and the children were fed, and Henry was asleep, and Clara was asleep, and the house was quiet in the particular full way that houses are quiet when they contain sleeping children, not empty quiet, not sealed up quiet, but resting quiet, breathing quiet. Those evenings when Nora sat with him on the porch or by the fire and they read or talked or did not talk, the mountains standing solid in the dark outside the windows, the fire warm, the rug under their feet, the bookshelves filling the wall. He thought sometimes in those evenings that he would like to thank Pete Hadley for his terrible directions. He thought he would like to thank the storm that had turned the creek up too high to ford, and the twisted ankle, and the carpet bag, and all the small, ridiculous accidents of a November night in 1882. He thought he would like to thank Nora for knocking on a sealed-up house and not apologizing for it. One October evening in 1886, when Henry was 3 and Clara was 1, and the mountains had taken their first early snow on their peaks, and the cottonwood on the hill east of the barn was brilliant gold in the afternoon light, Nora came and found him standing on the porch, looking out at the valley. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder and they looked out at the land together, the land he had worked for 15 years, the land that was theirs now in the full sense, not just his alone but shared, layered with the stories of both of them. "The cottonwood is very beautiful this year," she said. "It always is in October," he said. It was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think they would have liked this, all of it, the school, the children, the way the ranch is running?" He did not need to ask who she meant. "Yes," he said, "I think they would." He looked at the golden tree on the hill. "I think Clara would have found you very amusing. She liked people who had something to say. And Ellie," he stopped and started again. "Ellie would have shown Henry everything she knew about pebbles." Nora made a soft sound and pressed closer to him. "I am glad they had the mountains," she said. "I am glad of a great many things," he said. She turned her face up to him and he looked at her, at this woman who had walked onto his porch uninvited 7 years ago, who had refilled him like rain refills a dry creek bed, slowly and completely and irresistibly, and he smiled at her, the full and undefended smile that had been absent from his face for 7 years before she arrived, and that had not, since the night of their wedding, gone anywhere. She smiled back. "You are smiling again," she said, as she sometimes said, not to point it out so much as to mark it, the way you mark something good so it does not go unnoticed. "I have cause," he said. She laughed and the sound of it went out over the porch and into the Montana air, and the last of the October light caught it and held it. And below the hill the cattle moved slowly through the golden grass, and the valley was wide and the sky was the particular blue of a clear late afternoon. And inside the house, a small boy said something insistent in his sleep, and a smaller girl made the contented sound of a child who is deeply warm and completely untroubled. And Caleb Harrow stood on his porch with his wife's shoulder under his hand, and felt the kind of peace that is not the absence of sorrow but the presence of enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in all the ways that counted, everything. The stars came up above the Beartooth Range as the light failed, one by one, the way they always did, steady and reliable and indifferent to the individual lives below them. But he had stopped needing the stars to care about him. He had people who did. He had a woman who had stood at his sealed-up door in the rain and knocked and waited and refused to be turned away, not by distance, not by silence, not by 7 years of accumulated grief that had made a man forget what it felt like to be warm. She had waited. He had opened the door. And what came in with her, he thought, looking out at the evening with her hand finding his on the porch rail and holding it, what came in with her had filled every cold room in him, slowly and completely and without apology, the same way she had walked onto his porch that November night. Uninvited. Necessary. Entirely, irrevocably welcome.